Hello and welcome to Volume 1 of Japan-only PlayStation games, the series where we aim to shine a spotlight on some of the many PS1 games that never made their way over to the West. This is more or less a side series to my obscure and forgotten PlayStation games videos, and while that series is focused on Western releases that flew under the radar, this series is entirely dedicated to Japanese-only releases. And the good news is that Japan has by far the largest library of games on the console with well over 4,000 releases, the majority of which never even seen the light of day outside of Japan. Now, some Japanese exclusives do end up making a name for themselves in the West for one reason or another. Maybe it's a game from a famed creator like Hideo Kojima's Policenauts, maybe it's a really weird game and easy video fodder like LSD Dream Emulator, or maybe it's just Pepsi Man, which is, you know, Pepsi Man. But for the most part, the vast majority of games we'll take a look at on this series will be completely new to both you and I. The goal of these videos has always been about discovery, and frankly, there's no better bottomless pit of discovery than the Japanese PS1 library. Good games, bad games, weird games, we're aiming to leave no stone unturned here. So you may be wondering, how do I decide what games to play? Well, if you're familiar with my other videos, you'll know that I like to leave things up to chance. First, I aim to watch 10 seconds of footage from every single PS1 game using a YouTube channel called the Virtual Gaming Library. Anytime a Japanese exclusive game popped up, I put it down on a list. Now, unfortunately, even though I said previously we'll leave no stone unturned, that was a little bit of a lie. Unfortunately, I can't read or speak Japanese. I mean, I can barely speak English as it is. But this means that text-heavy games like visual novels, RPGs, adventure games, etc., they're a no-go, I'm afraid, except in some rare situations where there's a translation available, or they just look too cool to ignore in spite of the language barrier. Also, I decided to leave gambling and pachinko games off the list because there is frankly way too many of these things, and unless your name is Mr. Pachinko Fan 69, I don't think you'll have an issue with me leaving these out. But as for everything else, it's fair game. As long as it looks remotely playable to a Western audience, it's going on the list. From here, we take every single game we've jotted down and then we add it to a list randomizer. Once we randomize the list, we then take the top 100 games and add them to a big spinning prize wheel. We're then going to spin the wheel 3 times, and whatever 3 games we land on, those are the games we'll be looking at in today's episode. A friend of mine described it as basically the video equivalent of opening a booster pack of cards, and that's frankly a much better description than anything I could ever come up with, so we'll run with that. Anyway, that's enough time wasted. You came here for the games, and here's hoping the wheel blesses us with a fine batch today. So let's get to it. All praise the wheel.
The wheel will provide.
Kicking off Volume 1, we have Extreme Power, developed by a studio called Profire and released on the PlayStation in May 1996. Extreme Power is a 3D mech action game played from a first-person perspective. Well, you can choose to play in third person, but your mech kind of takes up most of the screen, making the game practically unplayable this way. Also, your mech has no animation, so yeah, first person it is. Conveniently enough, our first Japanese-only PS1 game is pretty much entirely in English. The menus, the items, the UI, it's not something you see too often, but I'll take it. Any of the cutscenes that detail the story are in Japanese though, but these are very limited as it is, so it won't really affect your enjoyment of the game in any way. Extreme Power reminds me a lot of Armored Core, not just because it's a PS1 mech game, but that its level and mission structure flow quite similarly to those games. Levels usually have one main objective, which is to destroy a set number of enemies or structures, destroy 8 of these things, destroy 30 of these things, destroy 8 of these things, etc, etc. You then enter an arena and destroy said objectives while either avoiding or destroying the many other optional enemies that are on the map. And once your objective is complete, the game then spawns in a boss or bosses for you to fight against. Defeat them, and then good job, the mission is complete. You'll get rewarded with points at the end of each mission. The more enemies you destroy, the more points you get. And then with these points, you can then buy new weapons or upgrades for your existing weapons through a shop. That's a nice gameplay loop right there. Now, this game did come out a whole year prior to the first Armored Core game, so if you're expecting a game with the same levels of mech customization and variety, you'll be sorely disappointed. Extreme Power only features one pilotable mech with about 6 weapons to choose from, a primary machine gun fire and 3 customizable sub-weapon slots, which can be equipped with anything from lasers to missiles to grenades. Each sub-weapon can be upgraded from level 1 to 3 using the points you make for missions, but outside of that there's really nothing else to spend your points on in-game. No skins, no new mech parts, just your weapons really, and if you're like me and found your preferred weapons early on, well then you'll be pretty much fully upgraded about halfway through the game with no need for any extra points. How you move from mission to mission though is quite interesting. When you start the game, you're placed on a map, and from this map screen, you need to decide which location you want to attack, and this is done in a turn-based fashion, with your turns progressing an in-game timer. Once you move to an enemy location, you begin a mission, and upon completion, that area on the map now turns into a friendly zone. The end goal is to move through the map from place to place, taking over each and every location, and once that's complete, you'll then gain access to the final mission. This isn't as easy or straightforward as it sounds though, because damage your mech takes within missions doesn't automatically regenerate. You do have the choice of repairing in between missions as long as you're in a friendly location, but doing so does pass more time on the clock. The more time that passes, the stronger the enemies get, and worse yet, sometimes the enemies will even try retake some of the locations you've taken from them prior, and if you're a long way across the map when this happens, then there's a good chance you're going to lose a base without any chance of a counterattack. I think this is a really fun and engaging way of progressing the game. It gives you more to think about both in and between missions, and opens up a lot of replayability with how non-linear it is. I'm a big fan of this. As for the gameplay, well, the mech's movement is pretty nice. The D-pad moves you forward and back and turns you left and right. You've also got a handy jump, you can dash from side to side using the shoulder buttons, and you can boost forward by pressing both buttons simultaneously. Movement generally feels pretty good and responsive. Unfortunately, the game sorely lacks a strafe feature, which makes things a bit tricky in the aiming department. And aiming overall is really this game's biggest issue in my opinion. You've got a central crosshair which is used for aiming. You can aim up or down while holding the R2 button, but since you can't strafe, you can only really aim side to side while turning, and turning in this game is just way too sensitive. While it's not really noticeable when moving around, trying to aim at this game's very fast moving enemies is practically impossible to do with any real accuracy, and this is a real problem, especially when most of the weapons in game require said accuracy to connect. Honestly, if it wasn't for the missile sub-weapon which thankfully locks on the enemies, I don't think I would have been able to beat this game. It's also a godsend that the sub-weapons have infinite ammo, so even in spite of the game's sensitive aiming, you can absolutely get by with the right mixture of weapons and exploiting a few different tricks here or there. Once you get into the swing of things though, it's actually pretty fun. Missions are quite short, taking roughly 3 minutes each, but they're full of fast-paced action, and the boss fights are pretty good too, even if I found that I never really had to deviate from my usual strategy of moving backwards and dashing left to right. Visually, it's a pretty simple game, which is to be expected from an earlier PS1 title. Environment geometry is very basic, but there is a good bit of visual variety to all the different levels, and they make for good combat arenas at least. The enemy and mech designs are really nice, but they can be pretty hard to make out during the heat of battle. The game does have a full gallery which lets you view each of the game's models up close, and I love the way these things look in this view. The way they are modelled and textured just looks really appealing to me. They look very of their era, but there's so many little details on each model. They just look really cool. The grey background with the little lights just adds to this too. I spent ages in this thing, by the way, in case you couldn't tell. And lastly, to my delight, Extreme Power's soundtrack, straight up the highlight of this game. I don't think you can call yourself a good mech game if you're not packing some fire tunes to go along with it, but Extreme Power is packing some serious heat. Over 20 tracks covering various genres from ambient to jazzy to hard rock and everything in between. Check out a small selection for yourself. somebody was nice enough to go upload the soundtrack on YouTube, and it literally has single-digit views, and most of them were probably me, so if you want to check out a genuine hidden gem of a soundtrack, Extreme Power is your game. Overall, I think Extreme Power is a fun but relatively simple game that's definitely rough around the edges in some parts, but if you can get to grips with the gameplay, there's definitely a good time to be had here. It is really short, taking under 2 hours to beat, and it very much feels like an early PS1 title, but it's got a lot of charm, some cool ideas, some really nice mech designs, and a hidden gem of a soundtrack to boot. Also, the game is fully playable in English and really cheap to buy online too, so if this seems like your kind of thing, there's really no reason not to give it a try. Worth it for the music alone, in my opinion.
The wheel will provide.
Okay, so I know what you're thinking. Sean, why are you playing a curling game? Well, the goal of this series is really to leave no stone unturned when it comes to game selection, and by no stone unturned, I guess that means curling stones, so here we are. The Curling was released in 1999 and both published and developed by Success as part of their Superlite 1500 series. For those unaware, the Superlite 1500 series is one of Japan's many budget game series. Think of them kind of like the PAL region's Platinum range or America's Greatest Hits range. Only in Japan, these series were not just used to re-release older games under a new lower price point. Developers would also make brand new smaller games exclusively for the series. And the Superlite 1500 series is just one of many. In fact, quite a lot of games from these budget series made their way over to the West, usually under different names, so sometimes if you see a crappy budget game on the PS1 or PS2, it could low-key be a pretty good Japanese game, just now featuring crappy box art. In fact, some of these games that initially started as part of these budget series would eventually grow in popularity and become established series here in the West, with games like Oni-Chanbara Bikini Samurai Warriors and the very popular Earth Defense Force series, which is still going strong to this day. But of course, not every budget release makes its way out of Japan, and this is the case with today's game, Superlite 1500 series, The Curling. Now, why did it never make it out of Japan? Well, I get the feeling there's not all that big of a demand for curling games, but then again, I'm not a big curling guy, nor am I a big sports guy in general really, but I mean, the sweeping part looks kind of fun, I guess. Imagine getting paid to do that. Is this the next step up from janitor? Professional ice janitors? Anyway, being a budget release, I didn't really expect much in terms of content from the curling, but even I was a bit caught off by how bare bones this is. You've got two modes to choose from, curling versus the AI, or curling versus a human opponent. I did try asking my girlfriend if she wanted to play with me. Hey Orla, do you want to play the curling with me?
The what?
The curling.
What's that?
It's a curling game.
No.
Okay, versus AI it is. You have the choice of 6 different playable characters. They all have the same stats as far as I can tell, so your choice is purely cosmetic. You then choose how many rounds you want per match, and then the game randomly selects an opponent for you to play against. And then bam, it's time for the curling. Yep, that's the curling alright. So yeah, this is the whole game really. I don't know what else I expected, to be honest. The gameplay is really straightforward. You line up your stone, charge the power up by tapping the circle button as fast as you can. You then hit the X button to release the stone, and your angle is determined by the meter at the bottom when you let go. Once the stone is in motion, the rest of your team comes out and you can tap the circle button to sweep and manipulate the trajectory of the stone. You know, curling stuff. The goal is to try get as many of your stones as close to the center of the target as possible, while preventing your opponent from doing the same, whether that means blocking or knocking your opponent's stones out of the way. And yeah, you've pretty much seen the whole game. It's one screen, a few character sprites, and a whole lot of curling. I mean, to its credit, the gameplay is simple and fun for what it is. I like the character designs and the sprite work is really good. The UI is clean and everything runs really well. Even the music is pretty good. It's just curling though. It feels almost like 1/10 of a full Winter Olympics game, if you get me. Like, if this was included alongside another 9 games in a full Winter Olympics package, then that would be really cool. Oh, sorry, what's that? Konami already did that in Nagano Winter Olympics 98. And it features full 3D curling alongside 9 other sports? Oh. So it looks like the curling isn't even the best curling game on the system. That's a shame. Look, this is a fine game for what it is. I just wish there was a little bit more, well, anything in it. Some different arenas, a practice mode, some simple minigames. As it stands, it's about as bare bones a game as you can get, and I guess you can't really expect much else given the game's budget price tag, but still, it's a shame. At least it's Western friendly, seeing as the only Japanese text is the player's name, so it's got that going for it, which is nice. I expect we'll see plenty more of these budget releases over the course of the series, but for now, the curling is one that you can probably skip out on without losing too much sleep.
The wheel will provide.
Vol.1's final game is Mobile Police Patlabor, Game Edition, developed by Bandai Vision and released on the PlayStation towards the end of the year 2000. If you're unfamiliar with Patlabor, this is a popular mecha anime / manga from the late 80s that remains quite popular in Japan to this day, although it never really hit the same heights in the West compared to series like Gundam. I've never read or watched it myself, but I've heard great things about it. It's also one of the rare mecha series to feature a female protagonist, so that's pretty cool. And if the title didn't give it away, this is the Game Edition. In other words, it's a game based on the series. What we have here is a cinematic fighting game, I guess you could say. The gameplay consists of 1v1 fights between different mechs known as labors. Battles take place within 3D arenas, but beyond that, the game feels quite different to any fighter I've played on the system. The core of this game's fighting system revolves around grappling up with enemies and performing a series of combos by timing button presses to execute different commands. The order of your commands dictates the type of moves you can do, and the goal really is to chain together the largest amount of combos you can, and the higher your combo, the more powerful the moves you can perform. It actually reminds me a little of the combat system from Xenogears, which is one of my favourite combat systems in any RPG. But the combat here in Patlabor is definitely much more streamlined and easy to master. This is the reason I call the game a cinematic fighting game, because there's really very little involvement from the player when it comes to executing moves. A simple button press and your character is battering the opponent, all from the view of a cool dynamic camera angle. Of course, while this flashy combat is the game's main gameplay feature, you won't spend all your time locked in a grapple with enemies. You have full control over your mech within the battle arena, although the control of your mech in this game is slower and more deliberate. You can walk and run, but don't expect any flying, jet dashes, or even jumping. There's some real weight to these mechs, and they actually perform closer to how you think a mech probably would in real life, just a giant hulking mass of metal. And when I said grappling is your main form of attack in this game, I wasn't kidding. There's no actual attacks that can be performed outside of the grapples, no punches, no kicks. The only exception is a gun that you can take out and fire at enemies. The process for shooting in this game is pretty unique too. Once aimed at an enemy, a targeting screen opens up and you have to line your shots up with the enemy. While this does do damage, it's really meant to be used as a way to stun your enemy, which will open them up for an easy grapple. You only have 6 shots per fight anyway, so it's something you'll want to use sparingly and strategically. Mixing things up even further is how enemies attack. Some mechs will have projectile attacks which function as you think, but enemies don't actually grapple with you, they attack using normal punches and kicks. These are clearly telegraphed with a warning sign that appears on the screen giving you the option to either block or dodge out of the way, which once again leaves your opponent open for a grapple. And this is pretty much the game's combat loop. Exploit your opponent's defenses, dodge attacks, and create opportunities to grapple up and dish out some serious damage. You'll also want to keep an eye on your grapple meter too, since you can only attempt a grapple whenever it's full. If you just finished an attack or missed with a grapple, you'll need to stay on the defensive until it charges back up over time so you can then launch an attack again. I really don't think I've ever played anything quite like it, to be honest, but yeah, it's actually pretty fun. The moves you can perform are generally quite simple. There's plenty of punches and kicks and quite a few wrestling moves thrown in as well. It genuinely never gets old hitting big robots with a lariat. It's not the flashiest moveset you'll ever see, but once again there's so much heft and weight to the labors that even the most basic straight punch feels like a freight train colliding with the opponent, so it's more than okay. Unfortunately, this cinematic combat style ends up being a double-edged sword because for as cool as it is, it's really rather simple and repetitive. The game's enemies put up very little challenge. Now, some of the later ones will test you a little bit, but most of the difficulty will come from actually trying to time your button presses to the prompts on screen, rather than the enemies themselves. If you mistime your button presses, you ruin your combo, and then the enemy gets a chance to hit back, which you can also just block by hitting another time button press. Once you reach the end of the game, which doesn't take very long, you'll have pretty much mastered and seen all the combat system has to offer. It still looks really cool, but without the challenge or any further technical depth, it's not something you'll be sticking around to play with after 1 or 2 playthroughs. And this hurts the game further because it's a single player only experience. The game only has one single mode, which does feature a ton of dialogue and story sequences, although I'd say well over half of this game, if not more, is dialogue and cutscenes, both in-game and using still images. Unfortunately, while the gameplay, UI and menus are entirely in English, all the story content and dialogue is in Japanese, which means if you can't speak the language, you're going to be missing out on a huge chunk of what this game has to offer. You can still of course play the fights no problem, but if you're skipping over the cutscenes, there's really only about 40 minutes to an hour's worth of gameplay here, and you only control the one mech throughout the entire game, so while the gameplay is fun for 1 or 2 sessions, the lack of additional content really hurts this game's replayability. Although, let's give Patlabor credit where credit is due, this game's presentation is fantastic. These have got to be some of the cleanest looking models I've seen on the console, really polished, loads of detail. This is a very good looking PS1 game. The battle arenas themselves don't really match up to the quality of the labors, but they still look pretty good all things considered. The game's menus and UI also looks really nice, and of course they were nice enough to add a model viewer in game, so you can view and admire the many labors up close if you like. The soundtrack is also, as expected, really good. I wouldn't say it's particularly all that memorable, but there's a few highlight tracks that really stand out, and I do love the cinematic way the game introduces your enemies with a great use of the soundtrack in these sections too. Also, I have to highlight these movie clips I unlocked when I beat the game. They seem to be trailers for some live action version of the series, but I don't think this version ever actually became a full feature film. But there's some great 90s CGI jank on display here. Absolutely worth beating the game for. Honestly, this is a really cool and unique game. It's just a shame that there's not more to it. I think as long as you know what you're getting into with this game, you'll probably have a really good time though. It looks great, you can swing giant robots around in a circle, and once again, it's entirely playable with no knowledge of the Japanese language. It is a shame that you miss out on a huge chunk of the game's dialogue and cutscenes, but at the very least the game did get me interested enough to look into checking out the original OVA series, so there's a positive there at least. All in all, if you like big robots baiting the shite out of each other, this one is worth trying out. And look, let's be honest, there's no better endorsement really, is there? And with that, it's time to bring Volume 1 to a close. We got to check out an early mech title with a baller soundtrack, possibly the second best curling game on the console, and a cool mech fighting game with some of the hardest hitting punches on the system. Before we finish though, at the end of each episode I like to slot each of the games into a tier. Is the game a must play? Is it worth trying if you like the look of it? Or is the game trash and not worth your time? But before we do that, I'd like to introduce a new section into our ranking. The new No Gaijin section, reserved exclusively for games that I found unplayable thanks to the language barrier. Thankfully that wasn't a problem today, as we see all 3 games slotting into the try tier. Extreme Power is a rough but charming action game that will definitely appeal to a lot of people, and Mobile Police Patlabor is still a really cool and unique fighting game, even if it doesn't offer much depth or replayability after a single playthrough. Now I know what you're thinking, the curling, making its way out of trash tier. Well look, I mean there's no denying it's incredibly bare bones on content and really simple, but like it's an alright curling game at the end of the day. It looks nice, it plays well, and it was released at a dirt cheap price point. Not exactly my cup of tea, but I'd be lying if I said I thought it was trash, you know? It's just kinda meh. So let me know, have you tried any of these games yourself? Are there any Japanese exclusive games you'd like to see show up in the series? Drop me a comment below, and if there's any games that I missed on the list, I'll be sure to get them added. And if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe is always very much appreciated. You can check out plenty more PS1 content over on the channel in the meantime, including the obscure and forgotten PS1 game series, which is more or less the same format if you crave a bit more random wheel action. But for now, thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time for Volume 2, and as always, praise the wheel.